The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass was a memoir by Frederick Douglass published in 1845. Um, at the time, this was the beginning of the, or part of the abolition movement right before the Civil War. And Douglass published a book to show what it was like to be a slave. The memoir covers his life starting as a slave and shows his change in, well, life circumstances, obviously because it's a memoir, but also change in his mindset about being a slave. I would say his escape from slavery, but he doesn't really talk about the escape. He talks about the process of deciding to escape is really the goal of the book. Um, so Douglass obviously was a born a slave. He had his father was um thought to be his master, but it wasn't proven, and his mother was a slave, so therefore he was a slave. His mother died early on, and at some point he was sent to live with his master's relatives in Baltimore, where he was taught his letters and um, started to get an education. Around that time, he talks about, I guess, when he starts to gain knowledge of the world outside of being a slave, he talks about how his mindset about being a slave started to shift, where he realized he wanted to be free and he wanted life outside of slavery. Because before, not that he didn't really have the desire to escape because he didn't know any better, but living in Baltimore and after he was briefly taught his letters and then he was smart enough and observant enough to start learning other things. He realized he wanted something new. He wanted something different than the life he was living now. The entire book is it shows Douglas's quest for freedom. To me, there were a few passages that really stood out and like were key points in um, the change in his beliefs or mindset. So the first one, as I mentioned before, was when he learned his letters. So his new master in Baltimore, his wife, when Douglas first arrived, wasn't. I don't think she had never owned a slave before, so she didn't really follow the exact same rules as the other masters, in which she began to teach him his letters. Um, that moment in time usually stands out like when someone reads a novel because they're like, oh wow, a slave is getting educated. What stood out to Douglas was the important part was what happened when his master found out. His master said, once you educate a slave, there is no going back. They're gonna want to be free. They're gonna want to develop. They're gonna want to grow and become more human than, well, I guess from his master's perspective, actually human. Um, so Douglas overheard that, and so what changed his mind about, or what started him on the process of realizing he wanted to be free, was not necessarily getting not really educated since he only learned his letters, but like a small bit of education. It was his master's reaction to that when he realized that this is something he should have as a right as a human being, but didn't have because the master was like, you can't have it. So at that moment, Douglas was like, I want to be free. I want to learn. So he started teaching himself to write. He tricked little neighborhood boys to teach him to write. He watched. He learned. Stuff like that. The second passage that stood out to me was when Douglas was older, probably about a teenager, when he had a cruel master. So this master's reputation, he had a reputation for beating his slaves. Like he had a reputation for having complete control over his slaves. And at some point, he and Douglas got into it, and Douglas beat him up. So nothing really happened to Douglas at this point because his master wanted to keep his reputation. So this kind of like mutually existed, but like didn't really have that whole direct relationship. This stood out to me because the fact that Douglas like had the courage to fight back shows that he was ready, or even as a teenager, he was ready to be his own person. He physically rebelled against what it was like to be a slave. He fought back. And you can see that as a child, he had, like, when he learned his letters, he was a child. So as a child, he had, like, the beginnings of the idea of wanting to be free. But you can see as he got older, like, this fight was a physical manifestation of what he wanted, what he needed to be free. Process that stands out to me is when I believe Douglas is a young adult and he goes back to Baltimore and he starts working as a ship caulker. So at this point, he still is enslaved, but he has a deal with his master that he can go work and, like, find his own jobs, but he gives his master a cut of his paycheck. So at this point, Douglas he's a nice lifestyle, but he realizes when he has to give his master, like, part of his paycheck, that he's still enslaved, that he's working like a free man, but he still has to give part of his money back to his master. So at this point, Douglas is like, it's solidified that he wants to escape. Over his entire, like, this entire, like, memoir, like, I guess his early life, the theme is that he wants to escape, but things, like, happen, or he doesn't forget, but it's, like, at the back of his mind. So at this point, the desire to escape comes to a fruition, and he's like, I'm ready to go. Because he has to do something like he's working like a free person, yet he's not. So at that point, he decides to escape. Now, in the novel, Douglas does not say how he escapes. Throughout, I guess I would consider that a shortcoming in the novel because we read this entire memoir and we're waiting and waiting and waiting to see how this man escapes, and he just doesn't say anything. But also, the reason he doesn't is to protect the people who helped him escape. So I'm thinking maybe he did the Underground Railroad, or somebody helped him, and want to he doesn't want to get them in trouble. Which I thought was also pretty interesting about this novel is throughout the novel, he does give the names of, like, his masters, but, like, the little boys who helped him in Baltimore as a child, he never says their names. He knows their names. Anybody who helped him, if they're white, technically would be breaking the law, but he never wants to get anybody who didn't do anything. I mean, they did technically do stuff, but, like, anybody who was not unjust to him, he didn't want to get them in legal trouble, which I thought was actually kind of nice, since he's talking about some pretty, like, dark stuff throughout this novel. Like, he talks about being beat by his masters. He does give, again, like I said before, he gives the masters names, but, like, he talks about, like, traumatic stuff. But I thought it was interesting that even though he's going through his own trauma, he takes care to protect the people he probably still cares about. Despite the shortcomings, I do think this memoir novel, I think it did what it was supposed to do. The part in the memoir wasn't really, like, it's, I guess technically it's an autobiography, but it's also very filtered to his purpose of the abolition movement. He leaves out any, I don't know, maybe there was happy details of his life. He left most of that out. He really filtered the purpose of to talk about his life in slavery and his mindset in slavery. It was never to talk about his outside relationships or friends or whatever. It was always about to talk about his life as a slave and trying to escape, not necessarily the escape route, but the what it does, I guess, the mental capacity, or, like, the mindset you need to be in to escape and go for your freedom. Because he's trying to recruit people to the abolitionist movement and help them understand what it was like to be a slave. The book shows his like change over time, and, like, his mindset changed over time, and it's really helpful to understand why he did what he did or how he did what he did. So yeah, this book definitely fulfilled its purpose.